The member from Hennepin, Representative Carlson.
I better get the mic. I've been operating out of my basement in my office so frequently I forget about the fact that we have a mic when we're on the floor. You know, I gave some thought as to how I wrap things up after serving 48 years, and it was really quite a dilemma. What do you say after you've had tenure that was as long as what mine has been? But I thought I'd begin with some thank yous, and the person that I have to thank the most is my wife, Carol. She came up from North Carolina in 1968 in June. In fact, we'll be celebrating that shortly. We kind of have created a tradition of celebrating when she made that move. I didn't know her at the time. I met her at Henry High School that following fall. And I was quite interested in that new English teacher. Found out that she was a staunch Democrat, very interested in politics, and had to wait, though, before I could ask her out, because I was quite involved in the 1968 presidential campaign for Hubert H. Humphrey. I was in charge. I think you'd kind of call it a field worker today, although I was still teaching full-time and I was not employed. I was a volunteer. But I was in charge of Bloomington, Edina, and Richfield for the Humphrey campaign. So when I finally asked her out in October, we had to adjust our dating schedule around my activities, both of us teaching, but my volunteer work on the Humphrey campaign. And by the way, he did quite well in Minnesota, and he did quite well in that area. I can take some degree of credit for that. I remember one of our longest dates was on election night down at the Leamington Hotel. We were down there until the wee hours of the morning waiting for the results for the Humphrey campaign. You know, that was one of the closest races in American history between Richard Nixon and Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey. Started dating her on October 10th. We've decided that was about the first time we dated, and we were married December 7th, a little less than 2 months later. So I really fell in love with that woman, and she's not only been the love of my life, but she has been instrumental in every one of my campaigns. Any aspect of the campaign she was in charge of. When we went through redistricting this last time, and I received basically a 85% new district, a good district, but 85% new. And Mike Freiberg was running in the part of the district that I had had for many, many years. For example, the city of Robbinsdale I'd represented for 30 years and so on. And we were at our DFL Central Committee, and I said, well, I still have my secret weapon, Carol Carlson. And when Mike Freiberg was making his comments, he said, well, I have a secret weapon too, and it's Carol Carlson. She has been instrumental, much to the dismay maybe of the other side of the aisle there, of making sure all kinds of Democrats, local and legislatively, have had good, well-rounded campaigns and quite a victory, number of victories that would be as a result of Carol Carlson, Carol Moss Carlson. But I do also want to extend not only a thank you to my wife, Carol, and all of her work over the 48 years, but my family as well. And you know, families do have some sacrifice as a result. I remember my daughter, who was 2 years old when the first time I ran, and some of you are aware she's the one that's very ill right now. But at any rate, we were involved with the Y and the Indian princesses, and that's a father-daughter relationship. And the fathers are supposed to plan a meeting. I think it was once a month and so on. My daughter's 49, so it goes back a long time. Well, guess who had to play the role very often of Dad? It was Carol, because Dad was over here, maybe a late night conference committee or something like that, I also remember with my 3 children, Dad's birthday is in April. I'm on a major conference committee, and the kids want to celebrate Dad's birthday. They're all young, so finally Carol said, "Can't you take a break? I'm going to bring the kids over, and we'll celebrate your birthday." So they came over, and guess where they wanted to go? Mickey's Diner. They had never been there. I had never been there, but they had seen it as we would drive around St. Paul. And let me tell you, it's a very interesting place at night. And all of a sudden, these people of the night, is the way I'll refer to them, interesting characters, got into my birthday party, you know, and we were in a back booth, and there was a cake, and I was opening my gift for my kids and all of that, and all of these very interesting people kind of got involved. So there are some positive things, but there's sometimes you have to make some difficult choices between family and your obligations here as a legislator, and I do appreciate the family support that I've had through the years. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about thanking the constituents in, I think, 6 different suburbs through the years with redistricting and so on that have sent me here to the Capitol. I've had to move twice as a result of redistricting. That was another strong issue within the family and strong support. We twice lived in an apartment temporarily until we could find a new house in the new district. And so those kind of personal and family sacrifices. But those constituents that sent me here for 48 years, the other members that I've had the pleasure of serving with, when a number of years ago, when Phyllis Kahn and I, we were tied, we were both elected in '72, became the longest serving members. They had a special event celebrating Phyllis and I, becoming the longest serving members, I think at that point in the House. And at any rate, somebody had done the work. Paul Thiessen was Speaker at the time, and Phyllis and I had served with 700 different legislators. And I've been here a few terms since, becoming the longest serving legislator in either body in the history of the state of Minnesota. Far behind a fellow in Wisconsin that's in his 90s, and I think he's approaching 60 years, and he's not running for re-election. So at any rate, I do have to thank the members on both sides of the aisle, and you do form friendships. You know, every once in a while, and I'm sure all of you hear it, you know, they'll say, "Oh, all you people do over there is argue and you bicker." They don't realize that you go over to the highway building, you have lunch together, and you become good friends. You are arguing your point of view here. That's the purpose. This is where we debate the issues of the day. And I think sometimes our constituents don't understand that that's part of the role of being a legislator, is to advocate for different positions and debate your point of view. One of the concerns I have, though, on that point, I was a teacher of government for many years, taught government for 34 years, mainly seniors. Sometimes I would have 9th grade civics, but mainly seniors over the years. And I used to teach that politics is the art of compromise. And I think that's been one of the big changes in my time. A lot of people will ask, how have things changed? Well, I think it's now, rather than being the art of compromise, it's the art of having the votes. And I would like to go back to a time when it was the art of compromise. I can remember Representative Lon Heinitz, who was from a neighboring district, and in my early days, he was a staunch Republican. I was a staunch Democrat. We were both involved with and interested in health care. And sometimes we would come at a different issue. We served on those committees together, with different points of view. But in the end, we would often come together, and we would very often have better legislation than either of us would have developed on our own. And that's what I mean about the art of compromise. The art of compromise is not a bad thing in my view. It's part of good government. And I wish we would go back to that. And I don't care which party is in charge, which committee you're talking about. Today it's boiled down to the art of having the votes. And I think that prevents us from listening to what others on a given committee or in the body as a whole would truly like to see. My background in politics, I grew up in a family that was politically aware. I don't think they ever missed an election. My mom and dad were not politically involved in a political party. They were staunch Democrats. My mother, for a time, was involved with the League of Women Voters. But at the dining room table, we would often, or the kitchen table really, we would often discuss politics and the current issues of the day. And I liken that to one of the reasons I became interested in government and politics and public policy, but also probably one of the reasons that I ultimately became a social studies teacher and spent most of my career, as I said earlier, teaching government and economics. So that was kind of my initiation into an interest in public policy. But my first direct involvement, I was taking a course at Mankato State University, now Minnesota State Mankato, and I was taking a political science course, and that was my core. And the instructor, it was 1962, had a requirement that you get involved in a political party or a campaign of your choice. And it was a minimal requirement. You were to get involved, spend about 6 hours, I think was what the goal was. And I went down in Mankato. They had a Democratic headquarters, so I went down there to do my 6 hours. And I really got into it. I ended up spending virtually all of my free time until the election once I had made that step. My next involvement in politics was also in Mankato. A fellow rapped at our door. There was a group of us that had an apartment living off campus, and he was running for the school board. So I struck up a conversation with him. I kind of liked him. And to this day, I don't know what his political background was, but I ended up pounding yard signs and dropping literature and doing a few things for his campaign. I don't think he won, though. But at any rate, that was another bit of initiation into politics. All of those things contribute to your involvement. But going back to my thank yous, I can't thank the staff for the Minnesota House of Representatives enough. The front desk here, the staff that works in nonpartisan research, the staff that works for the committees. And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of staff people over the years. I've find them of the highest quality of professionalism, whether they're working on the other side of the aisle or on our side of the aisle or in a nonpartisan role. And I do want to say thank you to them. I do want to mention probably 3 or maybe 4 people that I worked with because of the long tenure. One was a woman named Dory Vaughn. She was with me, I forget, 22 or 24 years as my LA. And by the way, when I was first elected, you didn't have LAs. We had a steno pool, and we didn't have offices. But shortly thereafter, we did make some changes. We moved into the state office building. We eventually had private offices, and we also had our own legislative assistant. And that was a huge change. So Dory Vaughn was with me for a long time. When Dory retired in 1998, Lil Polkamp became my assistant, and she was with me for 20 years. And the other day, many of you know Nancy Conley, if you happen to serve on Ways and Means, or back when I chaired the Education Committee and was involved with Education Finance, worked closely with Nancy Conley. So I asked Nancy a question the other day. I said, you know, when the dust settles and we got a little quiet time, figure out how many years that we've worked together, because she's had different hats depending upon whether I was the chair of a committee or we were in the minority. And she said, well, Lynn, it's 31 years that she had worked with me. She's been with the House a little longer than that. but those close relationships with people you work with is really something I do want to thank those people, and I can't thank them enough. And there are others. There's always, when you start mentioning people, the risk of omission. But those were three that were with me for many, many years. One day in caucus, one of the members got up, and I was just quietly sitting there, and said, I got a question of Lynn Carlson. And so I kind of perked up, and he said, how many LAs have you had since you've been here? And I said, well, I've had 2. And he said, that's exactly the problem. And he had had some session-only LAs and one thing and another, and some of you may on our side of the aisle know who I'm talking about, but I guess I had a bit of luck in that regard. Was fortunate I didn't have that kind of turnover and had some really good people to work with. I do want to mention a little bit about my first campaign. You know, if you asked me, Lynn, what was your winning margin by last election? And I'd probably say, oh, I think it was 60-some%. I'm not sure exactly what the vote total was, but you know what? My first election was 51.5% and 301 votes. You remember that one better than you remember the ones in between. And but I did win that first one, although it was a lot closer than future elections happened to be, much to my benefit, even with redistricting and new districts and living in an apartment on 2 occasions. But the other thing I was going to mention about that first election, I was actually thinking about running for the state Senate when I would have an opportunity. And so I started to visit some of the communities. At that time, I lived in Brooklyn Center, and the Senate district was Brooklyn Center, part of Brooklyn Park, and Fridley. So I'd gone over to Fridley and to meet some people and so on, and in the meantime, they were debating redistricting here, and I think Wendy Anderson had vetoed 2 redistricting plans, and it ended up in the courts. So all of a sudden, a new plan came out, and I pick up the newspaper, and it was a nice day, and my wife and I were at the picnic table, and I saw, by golly, there was an open House seat because the person that would have been the incumbent, who was from your side of the aisle, had decided to run for the state Senate. And then there was a young man that lived in this newly designed district whose father had been the mayor of Minneapolis, a United States senator, vice president of the United States, and was also back in the U.S. Senate again and had been a presidential candidate. So I thought, well, maybe that House seat looks pretty good rather than taking on the son of the former vice president of the United States for the endorsement for the state Senate. By the way, I think he went 6 or 7 ballots for the endorsement, and I got the endorsement from my political party on the first ballot. So that worked out well. That was a good decision. And by the way, as House members, many of you have probably been solicited by the Senate to run for a Senate seat. I know we had, I think she's left now, one of our members on our side of the aisle is going to run for the Senate. Well, I had that experience as well, and I'll just tell you a short story. I was chair of a conference committee. We met on a Monday morning, and we wrapped it up. And a very good friend of mine, Bill Luther, was assistant majority leader in the Senate, and he had talked to me, Roger Moe had talked to me about running for the Senate. You know, they like to recruit a House member. And so after the meeting, Bill came up to me and he said, Lynn, have you made up your mind about running for the Senate? And he said, one thing I want you to think about. If you're in the Senate, your vote counts twice as much. Well, I had been chair of the conference committee on the House side. Bill was a member on the Senate side. And I said, Bill, are you trying to tell me that my vote didn't count at least as much as yours did here this morning, and maybe a bit more? And he said, you're running for re-election to the House, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. And the point is that at a certain point, there isn't any real advantage to the Senate, I would say, at any point. I have always been committed to the Minnesota House of Representatives, and I like the culture here. It's a good place to work. And that wasn't the only time I've been recruited. A few years later, it was open again. My district has had two senators that have a habit of running for attorney general. One was successful and the other one not quite as successful. My first day in the legislature, I remember that quite well. Maybe remember some things about that first day better than I do some things about yesterday in some regard. Because you have a tendency to remember the new experience. And the first thing Patrick Murphy reminded me today when I came here, which is rather unique, we passed a bill on our very first day. It was defining a legislative day. And as you know, it's still in the law today, and legislative day is until 7 a.m. the following morning. That was the first bill. But after that, we had some controversial votes. It was the height of the Vietnam War, and one of the votes dealt with a member that had been protesting the war and had won re-election, but it had been a campaign issue, and so he was under indictment for not paying his income taxes. And thousands and thousands of people, maybe even into the millions, had done the same thing across the country. He had put the money in escrow, but the IRS doesn't care when you put it in escrow. And he hadn't been found guilty of anything, but that was one of our first votes, and there was another one that was somewhat controversial about seating. And I still remember looking around these beautiful chambers and thinking at the time, after we had a couple, three of those votes, and thinking, this was a nice one-time experience. Those first votes are just going to do you in, and I think everybody probably, whenever that happens, it was for me the first day, but for others it may be the first controversial vote that you have on the House floor, and sometimes you wonder if that isn't going to be the one that's going to do you in. Some of the things that I remember, not only that first day, but I had a member come up to me a couple of years ago in our caucus, and he said, I have seen everything. I have been in the majority. I've been in the minority. I've been back in the majority. He said, I've seen it all. And I said, not quite all. I said, I was here in 1979 when we were tied, 67-67. And that was quite an interesting experience. I was on the bargaining team for our caucus. We functioned just like a conference committee down in room 15. We had 5 people on the Republican side. Rod Searle headed up the Republican caucus in the negotiations. Irv Anderson headed up the Democratic caucus, and we negotiated the sharing of power. And it boiled down to the speakership. We had decided that the Republicans would have half the committees, we would have half the committees, they would be evenly divided. And Irv Anderson, not long before we were going to go into session, and by the way, we had a formal signed contract in the end, made an offer. He said to Rod Searle and the Republican caucus, we'll give you the speakership, but I want a one-vote majority on rules and any subcommittee that is created by the Rules Committee. One of the first things that we did, and Madam Speaker, you know the importance of bill referral. The Rules Committee passed a resolution that all referrals would be handled through a special subcommittee of the Rules Committee. And I happened to be on Rules. I served in that subcommittee, and we met virtually every day and dealt with the bill referrals. There's a cartoon, and I've still got the book. I think it was authored by Rod Searle, and it shows the DFL taking off with the Capitol Dome, and Rod standing at the speaker's desk, and I think Irv Anderson's name is on the tail or something like that. But that was negotiated, and actually we functioned reasonably well, considering we were tied. And I'll tell you this, you had 100% attendance at those committee meetings. And just as in a personal aside, my grandfather died, and I was concerned if I would make it back from the funeral on time. And Irv was our caucus leader, and he said, Lynn, I know you're going to your grandfather's funeral this morning. We're going to go into session later in the day, but I've talked to Rod Searle, And if you're not here because of your grandfather's funeral, he will not bring up anything controversial. In other words, he wouldn't take advantage of the fact that we were down a vote. And so there was a lot of cooperation even under those circumstances. One of the things I'm quite proud of, I've mentioned my 48 years, I've never missed a legislative day. I did get back from the funeral on time, so I didn't have to hitch a ride with the highway patrol, something I didn't know until the last minute. Irv had called the highway patrol, and they were on standby close to the funeral in South Minneapolis if I needed to get back here quickly enough. But I didn't know anything about that until really after the fact, and it was something that we didn't have to do. I did come close one day. Patrick Murphy and I were talking about it at the beginning of the session. We had a major snowstorm, a blizzard. And as I mentioned, I have had 100% attendance. They convened the House. I had gotten a ride with another House member, Ann Rest, who had been plowed out. I had not. I was shoveling my driveway, and I was in my snowmobile suit. And I called Ann, and I said, have you been plowed out? Yes. Well, if I can walk out to Winnetka, which is up my way, a major street, will you be able to pick me up? Yes, but you got to get there right away. So I put down the shovel. I made the dash to a couple of blocks down to Winnetka Avenue. She picked me up, and I walked into those doors in a snowmobile suit just before they were going to adjourn. So Patrick Murphy remembers that I made it just in the nip of time and kept my 100% attendance record. But for a long time, the rumor was that I had snowmobiled to the Capitol. And I've just told you the true story. I hitched a ride, but becoming with a snowmobile suit, that was the assumption that I had done that. You know, one of my legislative goals, some of you have talked about your legislative philosophy and so on. And the one thing I have to say is that I've seen my role as a legislator in creating opportunity. That's always been my goal, whether I was chairing the Education Committee or chairing the Finance Committee, which was very similar to Ways and Means when Margaret Anderson Kelleher was Speaker, or more currently Ways and Means. I saw my role as creating opportunity for the citizens of the state of Minnesota, especially my background in education, educational opportunity. One of the things that I'm most proud of was as a high school teacher, I would come home sometimes frustrated when I would see one of my students struggling. And I would say to my wife, Carol, who was also an educator, she started as an English teacher and eventually became an administrator at one of our local colleges. But I would say to Carol, gee, if my students could have only gotten a better start in the earlier grades. Well, I became a strong supporter of smaller class size K-3. I thought more individual attention will get those kids off to a better start, and they'll be more successful through the years. So I was a strong supporter of that. Then I got more and more interested in kindergarten, and all-day kindergarten. And I was successful many years ago in getting state funding for the first 50 all-day kindergarten sites. One of the senators said during the conference committee when I got the funding for that, I know what your goal is. You're going to want all-day kindergarten all the way across all over the state of Minnesota. And I said, that's no secret. That's my goal. But the resources I have right now are for 50 sites, and that's what I'd like to see happen. And it's what happened. What I didn't realize, it was going to take about 20 or 25 years before we finally achieved universal all-day kindergarten. But we did finally achieve that, and I think I can take credit for having planted the seed. And one of the people I worked closely with early on the bill was Representative Wagenius. She was very interested in it as well, and for many of the same reasons that I was. So if I were to look back and say, what did you do that was particularly important? One of the things that I would point to, and I suspect point to many, but it would be planting that seed for all-day kindergarten. Again, creating opportunity. Met many times with members to help them get a bill through. Sometimes they were having difficulty with their own caucus members, sometimes having difficulty just overall. And I kind of saw my role very often as a mentor. And when I announced my retirement, I was quite surprised at the number of legislators, past and present, who sent me a note thanking me for having mentored them in some capacity in the legislative body here. And by the way, some of those notes came from both sides of the aisle, and I'm particularly proud of that, because if any member ever asked me a question about how to proceed or what the best course of action would be, I always thought that my role was to be helpful. And so I was always very willing to do that. So creating opportunity was always my goal. The areas of my legislative interest I've mentioned already: education at all levels. I probably for about 20 years chaired one education committee or another. Most of that time, the Education Division of Appropriations, which had a very broad jurisdiction at one time. All the K-12 funding went through there, came from the Education Finance Committee that had a division, but we were the Appropriations Committee, so it came over there. We were the Committee of Origin for higher education, and we were also predating the Capital Investment Committee. Appropriations did all the capital investment. And so I would always have an article, because if I was chairing the Education Committee, dealing with, for example, K-12, the Faribault Academies, and so on. And then I would have all of the college and university facilities as well. So it was a very different system, but it was a nice place to be a committee chair. Over the years, the role of that committee has changed to now being the Higher Education Committee, but still serving a very important function, but doesn't have quite the broad jurisdiction. And later I chaired the full Education Committee, and we had 3 funding divisions attached. That's when the Speaker at the time eliminated the Appropriations Committee and went with a model very similar to what we have today. My first years in the legislature, I was totally involved with healthcare and education, but I was appointed to chair a subcommittee of the Health and Human Services Committee, and it was later renamed the Model Healthcare Committee. Right after I was appointed, I got called into Speaker Sable's office. This was my second term. And Speaker Sable said, Lynn, we just got a grant from a foundation, and you're going to have 2 staff people. Better staff than the full committee in those days. And one is going to be an attorney, and the other is going to be a person with a degree as a health generalist. It turned out to be a person that had a master's degree in public health. And they were the staff, and the goal was to see what would happen to with a legislative committee in the field of health care if they had appropriate staffing. And that was quite a high level of staffing back in the 1970s, where you would have 2 staff people for a subcommittee. And so we did a lot of things, and I ended up, as a result of that, being on the Health and Human Services Committee, which was a committee that subcommittee that I hadn't even asked for. I asked for taxes that first term. I was told back in those days, freshman, you'll never get on taxes. I did. I got on taxes. The other 2 committees just were out of the blue. Health and Human Services, that I hadn't even mentioned, it wasn't on my radar screen. And the other one was the Judiciary Committee. Now, I'm often full of stories, and I could probably go on even longer, but the interesting thing about the Judiciary Committee, Martin Sable, the Speaker, he announced, we're going to reform the Judiciary Committee. It had been probably going back to statehood, or at least back as far back as anybody's memory, made up of all lawyers. They had their own committee, basically. And so he was going to reform it. And he was going to put some lay people on it. So he put 4 lay people on the Judiciary Committee. 3 teachers, and the one that was not a teacher was Bob Vanasek, who later becomes Speaker of the House. So there were 4 of us. One of the teachers, in addition to myself, was later Congressman Bruce Vento. So we were on the Judiciary Committee, the 4 of us. Now, you want to know the true story. It wasn't necessarily reform. We didn't have enough lawyers in the DFL caucus to create a majority on the Judiciary Committee. So in classic Martin Sable style, I'm going to reform it. We're going to put lay people on, and maybe that was part of his motivation as well. But we didn't have enough lawyers, and he obviously didn't want to take some off, apparently, to create a different type of a majority. So education, healthcare, the environment, jobs and economic development, interest areas of mine throughout the years. I've always been troubled when you have a Meet the Candidates meeting, the League of Women Voters or the Chamber of Commerce, and they'll say, what's your number 1 issue this coming legislative session? I never have really had a number 1 issue. I think any legislator is going to be involved in multiple issues. And if you're going to be a good legislator, you are. Now, I've identified some of them that I was primarily interested in, but I've also, through the years, been very interested in having my hand in a variety of issues. One other thing that I was going to mention, because it came up in the debate, and it'll be my final story, and that is involving the Speaker as well. I was back in the days when I chaired the Education Committee, and I was on 2 conference committees, one with dealing with higher education and the other one dealing with K-12 or E-12. And so I get a note from the Speaker that he wanted to talk to me about conference committee. The Speaker at the time was Irv Anderson. So I go up to the Speaker's desk, and Irv said, Lynn, he said, I'm thinking of putting you on the NSP, as it was known then, XL now, Prairie Island Conference Committee. I said, Irv, I've never been involved with the issue. He said, I know, but I need an experienced legislator, someone that is good at bargaining and working on a compromise. And so he said, I'd like you to be, essentially, he didn't use this word, the swing vote. He said, I'm going to put 2 pro-NSP conferees, 2 from the environmental side, and you're going to be the 5th vote, and I'd like you to work out a compromise. So I said, Irv, and there was newspaper stories about what I'm about to say about what role he played. Did he guide that conference committee? Did he do this? Did he do that? I said, what kind of an outcome do you want? He said, one thing. There'd been some publicity about the granite up in Couchiching County. He said, I don't want any storage or casks in Couchiching County. Beyond that, work out a compromise as best you can. So that was the only direction he ever gave. Other than I do remember coming home one night and picking up the morning paper and the headline, Speaker of the House sends Health and Human Services Committee home for meeting after midnight. Well, we had met that very night until 4:30 in the morning. Guess who was sitting in the audience listening? The Speaker of the House. He never said a word about our meeting after midnight. But he was an old negotiator from up in the paper mill country up in International Falls, a union rep. And I think he understood negotiations, and we were making some progress that night. So the last thing he wanted to do was to disrupt the progress of those negotiations. The other thing, it's the only time in the legislature that I was assigned Capitol Security. There were so many threats and demonstrations. I was never personally threatened. One of the state senators was. But one night, about 4:30 in the morning, I pull onto the street I live on, and the lights go on. And it was a squad car, and I thought, whoops, what was I speeding? Did I forget to signal? Police officer comes up to the car, and he said, Representative Carlson, everything going well in St. Paul? And I said, yeah, what did I do wrong? And he said, not a thing. He said, we've been notified by your people, I assume that he meant Capitol Security, to keep an eye on your house because there were so many demonstrations, and they'd actually, for Steve Novak, who was the chief negotiator on the Senate side, stationed a highway patrol car out front of his house virtually full time. I never had any demonstrators show up, but it does show the security that was necessary. And then they planned a route for me to get down to room 15. I would go up above and around, and the demonstrators would be down below. And then I was supposed to alert Capitol Security when I was going down for a conference committee. So an interesting period of time. But the compromise that I worked out, because I was the swing vote, I was not the chief negotiator, but it was sort of de facto that I was that to get any storage, NSP would have to pay $500,000 per year per cask. And that was to go into a special fund for the development of alternative energy. And that's another thing that I can point to directly, that when I was given the charge of working out a compromise, that I was able to work out with the Senate. And as you know, we were debating that very fund here with the Wagenius bill just the other day. It's got, I think, currently 80 or 85 million in that particular fund. Originally, it was 17 casks. Another thing that I was involved with at the time that was part of the compromise that I put forward in the end that the Senate bought into was one of the reactors produced 400 megawatts of electricity. So, or 500 megawatts. And so we required 450 megawatts of wind power and 50 megawatts of biomass. Biomass wasn't as high a priority for me as the wind energy was, but that was what planted the seed for the development, especially in Buffalo Ridge, southwestern Minnesota, of wind energy. And as the prices come down, it's become more and more competitive. So I think if I were to mention just a couple of things in my tenure, 48 years I'd point to, would be that compromise that was a surprise, spur of the moment thing by the speaker. And the other one would be the all-day kindergarten. A third one, I was the architect of much of our current financial aid program for students. That also involved a foundation. We got a grant from the Ford Foundation to look at college affordability way back when, and out of that came the student financial aid program. We had a small one before that, but it was greatly expanded. And there again, when I say that one of my goals has always been, what can I do to create opportunity, whether it's the citizens of Minnesota, the young people in Minnesota, my fellow legislators, that's always been a goal of mine. So with that, Madam Speaker, I was told that I had 24 minutes, 1 minute for each term. I don't know how long, I wasn't watching the clock. I did tell Cassandra sort of tongue-in-cheek, I said, aren't I entitled to 1 minute for each year of service? In other words, 48 minutes? That would have probably drove you all crazy. I talked to my wife, by the way, and told her that I would be making a few comments today, and she said, Lyndon, keep it short, especially if you're going to be one of the last ones. They'll be bored to death hearing from you. And I didn't listen to my number one political advisor. I guess I rambled on a bit. But I did enjoy the opportunity to say a few words at this point in time. And I have a sneaking suspicion we're going to be back on this floor sometime in the future. So this isn't the day that those of us that are retiring are totally wrapping it up. But I've always enjoyed these retirement speeches. And one compliment for the current speaker, by the way, doing it at a time when people are awake. We've done this in the middle of the night sometimes. You know, we adjourn at midnight, and then we start the retirement speeches. And some of the poor retirees are getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning and giving their speech. So at least I had a night's rest. But my one disappointment here this afternoon, I would have loved for Carol to be here. and she's doing important things in Northern Kentucky right now. So she wouldn't be able to be here. But that's my one disappointment as I wrap things up. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
It's definitely 1 minute for every year, and you were pretty close. I think I speak for the whole body when I say that you will be so missed, and there will never be another Lyndon Carlson in this body. We're so glad you served.
Find more local news stories at ccxmedia.org and follow us on social media.